So welcome everybody and good evening. To some of you, it's welcome back. Those of you who were with us this afternoon when we presented little glimpses of what we've been doing in the overheating team of the last 4 or 5 years. And to some of you, it's just welcome because you weren't here this afternoon. So what we were doing this afternoon was to talk a bit about what we've done and what we feel that some of the things that we feel that we've achieved during these years. Although, as I pointed out, and I'll repeat it now, in many research projects, publications come last. You have activities, you have lots of things going on, but the publications frequently come out, well, after the end of the research project as such. Some have come out already, some are on their way. And some are not quite on the way, but they will be very soon. So in the next couple of years, you'll see more than a trickle, you'll see a stream of overheating publications coming out. Overheating, for those of you who are not 100% familiar with it, has been a research project funded by the European Research Council, the ERC, through an advance grant for which we are immensely grateful for 5 years, enabling us to do slightly larger pieces of research than we used to coordinate our efforts, to think along longer and larger lines than we are used to. So we've been looking at the implications of accelerated changes for local livelihoods and local lives across the world. And we've had fieldwork in 6 continents, all the continents except Antarctica. All of these sub-projects have somehow related to processes of accelerated change, frequently in the realms of the economy, finance, culture, identity, and or the environment, climate, and occasionally all 3 at the same time. So that's what we did this afternoon. This evening, we are very pleased and grateful to be able to welcome 3 of our favorite anthropologists who will tell us something, perhaps, that we may be able to use to move the conversation a step forward. So what are we going to do now? Overheating is ending, but every end is also a beginning. So this is the transition between the end and the beginning of something else. So I'm very excited about this, and I now pass the floor to this evening's chair, namely Katrine Thorleifsson, who was a postdoctoral fellow at Overheating and who is now a researcher at the Center for the Study of Right-Wing Extremism at the University of Oslo. Was that right? Yes. Great, thank you. So I pass the floor to you, Katrine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to see so many people have shown up. And it's also a great pleasure of mine to introduce our favorite anthropologists today and distinguished speakers from University of Toronto, Tanya Lee, Professor Tanya Lee, from University of Harvard, Professor Jean Komroff, and from the Max Planck Institute of Social Anthropology, Professor Chris Hahn. Now I'm going to guide you through the evening today, and we're going to also have a quick break during the presentations, which is going to be half an hour of mingling break with refreshments. We're going to first have Tanya Lee, which will give the first keynote, followed by prepared comments by Chris Hahn, 15 minutes of questions and answers. And the same procedure is going to following Jean Komroff's keynote speak, the second keynote speak, prepared comment from Chris Hahn, followed by Q&As. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Tanya Lee from University of Toronto. Tanya Lee is the director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Her research focuses on culture, economy, environment, and the development in Indonesia's upland regions. And she has published extensively on Indonesia's indigenous people movement, land reform, rural class formation, struggles over the forest and conservation, community resource management, and state-organized resettlements. And her current writing project is titled Plantation Life, which explores social, political, culture, and economic lives that emerge among people in the orbit of a massively expanding plantation crop. So without further ado, welcome.
light is really bright. Is there any? Okay. Good evening. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. It's my first time also in Norway. So the work that I want to present today is drawing on a project that I'm working on together with James Ferguson from Stanford University. We've been doing some common thinking and writing around the theme that I'm going to present. So it's very much work in progress. Probably the first public airing of what we've been cooking up. And the title of this that I'm presenting today is After the Teleology of Development, Questions for Empirical Analysis. And I chose this talk because I think and hope it will build on your overheating themes. So one thing that struck me reading the overheating document that I was sent is there is a bit of a residual teleology in this idea that the world is overheating, as if it's going in one single direction. But is the world as a whole overheating? Or is it heating up in some places and cooling and stagnant in others? So in this lecture, I will argue that we're in a stage of profoundly uneven development in which the comforting teleology that assumes the world is headed in one direction, from country to city, from farm to factory, from tradition to modernity, really cannot be sustained. Academically, sort of intellectually, empirically, it cannot be sustained. Nevertheless, the development industry still holds out the promise that everyone in the global south will eventually head down the transition path. And in the global north as well, politicians assure people that after austerity or after the recession, everything will return to normal. So it's as if this teleology can still be counted upon. What we're dealing with is kind of, blips and deviations, but on the whole, we still know the progressive direction in which everyone will head. If we are, as scholars, willing to sort of frankly acknowledge that this teleology of development, this unfolding, is not in fact what's happening, and that what we are seeing is a serious, permanent divergence across the world. And this is not just the old kind of divergence, kind of north versus south, but divergent pathways within and between regions, surprising similarities across north and south. But really, the suggestion would be that we really are not all heading in one direction. And if that's the case, then I would suggest that a new set of questions really have to be asked much more seriously than they have been in the past. And these I will list out later as sort of candidate for some of the kinds of questions which I think will emerge after the teleology of development. But the first thing I want to ask is, why is this teleological story so very stubborn? I mean, intellectually, we've known for a long time that we can't count on modernization ideas, this kind of unfolding. Intellectually, academically, we know there's a problem with this, and yet it's mighty stubborn, and a lot of people are still extremely attached to this narrative. And I was actually alerted to this first very strongly by reading the World Bank's World Development Report on Agriculture, which came out in 2008. And much to my shock, this document really repeated the classic transition narrative unrevised. So it really laid out a scenario in which the assumption was that every country, each and every country, would travel a transition path from farm to factory, from country to city, from low productivity to high productivity work, more or less as had been the case in Europe in the 19th century. And not only did they assume this transition, and they actually lined up all the countries of the world along this pathway, like how far along the pathway they were, and classified countries as sort of beginning stages, kind of transforming, kind of already there. So very, very linear. But they also maintained the national frame, which is the frame that, of course, the World Bank and the UN agencies are very wedded to. They organize all their data according to nations, treating these as sort of homogeneous and comparable elements. But if you think about this in transition terms, it really makes no sense to imagine that, for example, the manufacturing sector will emerge in each and every country. I mean, why would it? If there's manufacturing jobs being created in China, that's a pretty good reason why they would not be being simultaneously created in Indonesia. But if you're a farmer kicked off the land in the backwoods of Indonesia, the existence of such jobs in China is of no use to you, right? So this idea that it will all add up, that there will be transition pathways, not only in every place, but actually at the right time. So at the point where you're kicked off the land and desperately in need of the job, such a job will arrive. I mean, this is basically what this document was proposing. And of course, it's completely preposterous. And yet, this narrative continues to be present. And I would argue that it continues to do really powerful ideological work. So if we think about why are agencies so attached to this teleological development narrative, one reason it's sustained by agencies like the World Bank and the UN system is because this teleology of development is really their raison d'etre. It's the idea that they are in the business of intervening to remove obstacles to transition, coming up with projects and proposals to move backward countries along the transition path. I mean, all of this sounds very 1950s, but it is still absolutely alive and well in the sort of development arena. So the legitimacy of these organizations depends both on the narrative in the sense that they're intervening to bring this about, but also on the fact that the graphs go, in the right direction. Maybe there's a few lags and a few blips, but on the whole, this kind of path of progress shown year by year by year is absolutely essential to the work that these agencies do and to their existence. But similarly, national governments and politicians maintain this narrative of progress, because it does a lot of work. Present harms, inequalities, sacrifices, losses. Many things can be justified in terms of a brighter future that is to come. Structural adjustment, austerity, even environmental ruin, looking at those pictures of the Canadian tar sands this morning. Basically, there is, in fact, indeed present suffering, but that's okay because all the suffering will be creative, destruction is creative, and progress will be the outcome down the road. So this type of narrative then is very important to these transnational agencies, it's important nationally, and of course many people, also sustain it because their hope and expectation and desire is very firmly pinned there. Many of us are very hooked on the idea that our children's lives will be better than their parents', that somebody with a thatched roof will get a tin one. Sometimes this is narrated in relation to the past, a golden past will be restored, but whichever way it's framed, the idea that the future will be better than today is something that's very ardently held. And so it's not only an official narrative, it's a popular narrative, really worldwide. We as scholars, however, should be well past, I would say, we should be far after the teleology of development, this idea that everyone is headed down the same transition path. And there's many ways that one could kind of pull this apart, but one of the first ones I want to sort of suggest is that all of the things which are rolled into this narrative of progress, of course, do not naturally cohere. So, for example, you would have a reduction in poverty at the same time as you have an increase in inequality. Or you could have an increase in incomes at the same time as you have an increase in insecurity due to the fact that your source of income is that someone is away as a migrant, or maybe because the source of your increased income is environmental ruin, right? So these things don't actually all line up so that progress in all elements is sort of in the same period, heading in the same direction. So that would be one of the first ways of breaking this apart. If one thinks also of some of the other kinds of phenomena that the old transition, modernization narratives attempted to explain, take growth, for example. Yes, there is economic growth in many places, but it's profoundly uneven, as we know. It's profoundly uneven in spatial terms. It's massively unequal in social terms, in terms of who benefits and loses. Some of this growth has been jobless, therefore disconnected from increases in or improvements in livelihood. So many of the kinds of linear concepts attached to growth actually fall apart once you take that approach to it. The narrative of urbanization is another one. We're told that now 50% of the world is urban. So, urbanization was part of that modernization narrative. And it is true that 50% of the world's population now lives in cities. But this doesn't mean that cities like Lagos or Kinshasa are becoming like London or Paris. What it means to be urban, the form of the urban, is not about conforming to the model which is already laid down in the assumed march of progress. It could be something completely different, which isn't on the path to becoming, like the cities that are supposed to serve as the pinnacles or the models of this. To take another example, yes, people may leave the land, but this does not mean, quite obviously, that they march off into jobs. And often they may retain land for reasons which have nothing to do with work or production. So, this assumption that, you will break ties with the land and move into the city, again, doesn't really pan out empirically. So, something which I think was mentioned in this afternoon's session, which is an important part of this, is that often what has replaced this teleology of development or modernization is a sort of a counter-narrative, which Jim calls apocalyptic neoliberalism. But it really is this idea that everything is going to hell, right? That is all death, damns, and destruction. And that clearly is not the case either, right? Many of the places that we encounter, where we work, where we live, are actually quite optimistic about the future. They do actually think that their lives are getting better. And that also needs to be accounted for. Like, if our only replacement for the sort of modernization progress narrative is it's all going to hell sort of narrative, that too is too clunky, it's too linear, it's too global, and isn't really going to do the job. So what we're suggesting then is that in place of these, overly strong kind of muscular linear narratives, we need to be much more serious about grasping the current global order as profoundly differentiated. Global, but differentiated in all kinds of ways. And once you say that, it seems as if, we're now without a compass. Like, we don't know what's happening, we don't know the direction, so then what? So what we've been trying to do in the project we've been engaged in is to think about some lines of inquiry, some concrete empirical lines of inquiry, which are in a way portable, across north, south, urban, rural, but which would serve as guides to analyzing this profoundly differentiated contemporary terrain. So the first of these questions then, which I think is worth asking, is what is or is not changing about work? We in the modernization narrative, the assumption was that the sort of the pinnacle of this linear trajectory was that more and more people would have stable wage work, salaried work. And we know that actually that's not happening, right? That there's counter trends towards casualization, towards outsourcing, that it's strongly diverging. It's not as if people the people who were once in the informal sector are, as was once imagined, gradually becoming absorbed into formal jobs. Sometimes that's happening, and sometimes the opposite thing is happening. So we really need to make a completely sort of open-ended empirical question about what is happening to the world of work. Which sectors of the global, national, local economy are shedding or hiring formerly employed workers? Who has access to these jobs? Which kinds of paid work are outsourced or contractualized? Which kinds of worker, on the other hand, are subject to bonding or capture or indenture? Like, both of these things are happening simultaneously in different arena. Who does what kinds of informal or own account work? What kinds of work have become commodified, shifted from being unpaid to paid, or decommodified, shifted from being paid to unpaid? How has technology figured? I think some of the apocalyptic narratives figure technology as always job destroying. I mean, clearly it's also been job creating in some sectors, in some contexts, in some arenas. So the changing world of work seems to be something that we should take head on, without assumptions about its direction, and investigate. Equally important would be the changing meanings of work. I think in the modernization narrative, the idea was that many people would become formal workers, and The idea that work would be the fulcrum of meaning and, in fact, social membership, that rights would be attached to you as a worker, like this form of citizenship which hinges on a worker identity, was very important to many people, even people who have never had such jobs. It was still the hope. And I would say that given the expansion of secondary school education all over the world, secondary school students from the north to the south actually do, or in fact, instead of stating, I should make this a question, do they in fact aspire to and expect formal, salaried, paid work, or do they see themselves as permanently locked out for this kind of work? Is this the kind of work which they expect, that their parents expect? So I think there's a whole set of questions around the meaning of work, whether it is in fact the fulcrum of one's identity and meaning or not, is something which needs to be assessed. Students that I asked this question to in Toronto, many of them expect downward mobility. They do not expect to be able to replicate the class position of their own parents. Those who are immigrants really worry that they won't be able to meet their parents' expectations for upward mobility. And none of them expect to have careers of the kind that I've had and expect to have to form their identity, meaning, and social membership based on other things, whether it's their political activism, whether it's their cooking skills, or whatever it is. But when I look at the place that work has in their lives, and it's far more differentiated than these existing kind of narratives and expectations suggest. So gender and generation are clearly going to be important criteria then in this investigation. Alongside nostalgia and desire for a proper job, and regret that the proper job is hard to get or nowhere to be found, we have an expanding category of the idea of the entrepreneur. And I think this idea of entrepreneurship is sometimes being promoted as a way governments and other kinds of development agencies can make people responsible for creating their own jobs. But this, again, one should turn into a question. For what kinds of people are entrepreneurial futures, the idea of, if not a proper job, then a proper business, actually being proposed as modes of livelihood, but also forms of meaning, of identity, of how you will get to be a person of substance in your community. And the spectrum of people who are being pointed in this direction is quite remarkable. Even school children, the poorest people, all kinds of folks are now being made responsible for creating their own work. So a preliminary list of these kinds of entrepreneurial programs would include entrepreneurship programs for migrants to channel their remittances into community development, for Indigenous people to commercialize their arts and crafts, for women to engage in micro-enterprises financed by microcredit. In my university, for engineering students to get out of the boring mindset in which they think they need to go and work for the man, and instead to think of themselves in kind of .com terms as we actually have hatcheries, and there's a program in the university called Entrepreneurial Evangelism. I'm thinking, why are we doing this? What is the imaginary which is really promoting this to young engineers as the future to which they aspire? Is it because they're afraid there won't be jobs, or because this type of future has been kind of newly valorized in a way which I think is novel? Anyway, what I'm suggesting is that around work and ways of gaining a living, a whole range of things are going on, which actually require empirical investigation. So the second arena of questioning is around the changing uses and meanings of land. So we're used to thinking of land, primarily as a productive resource, and it gets pulled into modernization narratives often as an underutilized resource, which by virtue of investment and proper use can be brought into a higher productivity arena. But I think it's an empirical question, really. Who does access rural or urban land, and for what purpose? I mean, Jim wrote a paper called How to Do Things with Land, in which he opened up that question, and a lot of my work has also been around this theme. In the book I wrote, published recently, Land's End, This was about a place in which land really was the key means of production. It was an entirely agrarian economy. There's very little off-farm work, no remittances. So that's a place in which access to land really is everything. Everything depends upon it. But in many other contexts, people have a piece of land or perhaps a room or a house or a shack, which may play a big role in livelihood strategies, not necessarily in terms of production, right? It might be the place where you park granny who gets her pensions, children who centralize remittances, a place where unemployed young people go to, lie low and live cheap for a while. Basically, land and housing, these are all questions that need to be asked about what are the uses and meanings of land in contemporary livelihood strategies. Also, what are the meanings of land in terms of national and community membership? What are people struggling for when they demand land reform or recognition of ethnic homelands and indigenous territories? Not necessarily for land as a productive resource, but for land perhaps as a fulfillment of a type of differentiated citizenship, whether it's an indigenous citizenship or some equivalent. If you think about Via Campesina, the peasant way, what's being claimed there is the right to live a certain kind of life, in which land figures. As we know, many of land reform beneficiaries in Brazil, which is the famous case, actually cannot survive on their land. It isn't productive. They're supported, massively subsidized by the Bolsa Familia program of transfers. But that's not to say that land is not therefore important to them, right? They may be struggling for it because it provides precisely the kind of anchor for family, identity, social meaning, place, membership. It may do all kinds of really important things which are not to do with whether it's actually economical to grow things there or it's cheaper to buy your food, for example. So these are among the questions one could ask about land. So that's really the second bunch of questions. The third set of questions, which I think arise north and south alike, have to do with the other ways in which people access livelihood resources. So many people do not work for their living, right? They acquire their daily sustenance through transfers of some kind. So we're quite familiar with stories about migrant remittances. We're also quite familiar with discussions of credit schemes, ways in which current livelihood is financed by credit, borrowing on the future. A big expansion globally in cash transfer programs, which have become more important in the global south, also continue to be really important in the OECD countries. One study I read indicated that in most of the OECD, the level of poverty without transfers would be 40%. With transfers, it's 15%, which shows that transfers are a massive part of the effective standard of living in people in the global north. So these have to be factored into how we understand the contemporary arena. And now these are not just global north questions, but also questions related to the south. And then there's the whole issue of kinship, transfers which depend upon personalistic relations, patron-client, and kin-based. And these are very important everywhere. When I try to figure out how young men in Indonesian cities survive, those who stand on street corners and hustle and don't appear to have much to do, well, they're crashing on the floor of their cousin and their auntie always has food in the pot and never turns them away, right? So there are ways in which informal forms of kin-based subsidy and transfer are supporting a lot of people who are apparently not working and yet are not destitute, which isn't to oversell moral economies as if this is all just on autopilot. I mean, even a once favorite nephew can eventually wear thin his welcome and be turned away. So these things are always under negotiation. But I think it's a terrain we have to investigate, and I guess I'm suggesting it's relevant here as well as there, right? It's basically relevant everywhere. The fourth arena of questioning is really to do with changing forms of social membership. In the modernization narrative, the sort of teleology of development, the assumption was that either people would become attached to their work in the same way that many of us are. If you ask someone, who they are or what do they do, they're very likely to talk about their work, right? Professional identities, worker-based identities are one of the kind of modern forms. In the absence of those kinds of identities, what else? And another assumption was that the nation state would become progressively more important as the fulcrum of identity and meaning. And obviously we've seen, as one of the presentations this morning, a kind of re-emergence of nationalism, in which people are surprisingly staking a lot on claims to the nation, but also other contexts in which either the nation has imploded or people's horizons of social membership just do not reference national terrains, whether these are religious communities which are transnational, whether they have to do with diasporic kinship networks, trading networks, whether they have to do with forms of consumption, my Facebook group, my people who like watching the same kinds of media, listening to the same kinds of music. The whole question of how people peg their social membership and belonging, if we can't assume the forms that we once knew, family, community, work, nation, then a whole bunch of new questions open up. What we don't find, and this is a bit of a problem with the kind of apocalyptic narratives, we don't really see a lot of anomie, a lot of people drifting around like isolated items. And I missed this a little bit in the presentations earlier in the afternoon because they were a little bit death, damnation, and destruction, right? I mean, a lot of it was about what is lost and what is being destroyed. And that's, of course, very important. But it does beg the question, what then emerges? What are the forms in which people construct meaning, identity, social membership? And not to say we're going to love those forms, right? I mean, it could be the kinds of, right-wing stuff that Katarine's been investigating. It's not to say that all of these forms would be ones we would approve of, but definitely they're doing something which previous forms of identity which we assumed are either not available or not attractive or are not grabbing people in the same ways. So that's, again, a big group of questions. The final set that we are really thinking about is what forms of politics emerge then in this arena? And what kinds of leverage do people have for political action? So we're very used to the idea, or the familiar idea, is fairly laborist, right? It's the idea of the worker, the strike. If one thinks about the kinds of social compacts which figured in Northern Europe, which involve organized labor, capital, and the state, it's not apparent that the basis for social compacts of those kinds exist in contexts where labor is not organized, or is not an organized force, is not a partner in those kinds of negotiations. So what kinds of leverage do people have if they can't go on strike, right? They don't have a job, they can't go on strike. Does this mean that therefore they have no way of exercising leverage and making claims? So I think there's a whole set of questions one could ask there about what people demand. Think of the Spanish chant, pan, techo y trabajo, roof, bread, and work. So first of all, that's interesting. Like, why is it that Spaniards think those are the things that people can demand? And secondly, why do they think that the Spanish state is the kind of entity that should make good on such demands? If you made those kinds of demands in Indonesia, it would make no sense whatsoever, because the state is not a plausible subject of demands of that kind, right? It's never been the kind of state that you could count on to provide you with bread or housing, for example. So one of the things which comes out of this kind of analysis, and I think this is actually where the differentiation takes a slightly different turn, is what I see anyway as a really important the importance of national histories and trajectories. It seems that, in my discussions with Jim on this, like, why is it that South Africans are feisty and demanding, whereas Indonesians are not? There's a specific history to that. Both the anti-apartheid struggle, the way in which Black South Africans see themselves as entitled to a certain kind of care and delivery on the part of the government. You know, in Indonesia, a very different history, 500,000 people massacred, you know, a government which has been far more extractive than distributive, and against which such claims can't be made. But if we looked at all the different national contexts where we're working, this question of what are the plausible claims that one could make in relation to the state? And if it's not in relation to the state, well, who is the subject of claims? Is it a UN agency? Is it a humanitarian organization? Is it a corporation? Like, basically, what are the targets of claims? What is the content of claims? These would be things which are, you know, globally really worth investigating, and it's going to turn out to be quite a varied field. When people do make claims, what is the basis of these claims? Why do people think that they are entitled to a share of something? Do people believe politicians' promises, or is the assumption always that these are vacuous? Do people vote? You know, what do they think voting does? What does it accomplish? So I think that this is a kind of a terrain on which it's not so much north-south, it's actually very specific kind of national histories, I think, which configure these sets of relations and the kinds of politics that people are engaged in relation to states, but also in relation to each other. You know, what kinds of alliances, what kinds of organized groups, do people expect equal treatment from the law, or is the law a joke? You know, all of these are things which differentiate sometimes even between neighboring countries. So I can just give a really brief example from the territory that I'm more familiar with from Southeast Asia, and I think of this in terms of really different resolutions of the Cold War. So I've already mentioned that, you know, in Indonesia there was a massacre, and basically the people who conducted this massacre are still in power, and there is a population that is not demanding, does not feel entitled, may or may not vote, but doesn't expect much. If you contrast this with Thailand, where in the same period, the mid-70s, or in a similar period, the Thai army, you know, chased a few students off the campus and they joined the communists in the bush, but the basic strategy was to outcompete the communists in the countryside by providing a very high level of public infrastructure and rural services, to such an extent that Andrew Walker argues that there is now no poverty in rural Thailand. So what they did was, you know, a very different resolution. They were successful in outcompeting the communists. Accidentally, they produced what Andrew calls Thailand's political peasants. And if you recall, in 2010, you know, a few tens of thousand annoying peasants from northeast Thailand occupied a key intersection in Bangkok for 2 months. So, you know, they are there because they think that making their presence felt means that they have to be dealt with, and they will be dealt with. They will demand, you know, redress, they'll demand something. So that's a very different history, right? Thailand still has an active, the Philippines still has an active insurgency. Vietnam has still a recognizably communist regime in some ways, to the extent that Vietnamese workers, according to my reading, do expect that their rights as workers will be upheld, and do expect that party officials will support them when they mobilize as workers. So, you know, different trajectories, neighboring countries. 100 years ago, they were all very similar, you know, big agrarian territories with quite divergent national trajectories, which I think are now really coming into play, or continue to have resonance in terms of the different kinds of political struggle and the different kinds of resolution that we'll see in the years ahead. So this is my offering to your group. What I'm suggesting is that after the teleology of development, like if we give up on the notion that we know which way it's headed, and we recognize that this kind of divergence is not about north versus south. This is a radically differentiated territory, or a radically differentiated set of processes within and between regions, sometimes between genders, generations, spatially within countries. Basically, the whole thing is open to inquiry. It doesn't mean to say it's radically open in the sense that anything goes. A lot of this is path dependent, and my discussion of national politics would be one example of that. But it does mean that we need both some conceptual consistency and rigor, otherwise we don't know kind of what we are examining. But it also means that freeing ourselves from the teleology of development, from the idea that what we're seeing as we look around the world is just little eddies and lags, and some people are kind of not there yet, but it will happen in the end. If we free ourselves from that kind of teleological thinking, I think our analysis would get sharper, and I think we would be quite surprised by the really diverse set of processes, practices, imaginaries that we would encounter. Thank you. Oh, great.
Great, thank you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Chris Hahn from the Max Planck Institute. Chris Hahn is actually a member of the Heating Project. He's a professor too at the Department of Social Anthropology. And you also have research interests in economic organization, property relations, religion, civil society, ethnicity, and nationalism. And your empirical field of expertise is rural Hungary and Poland. And you're also the PI, I have to do some advertisement on your behalf, of a newly funded ERC project called Eurasia, Civilization and Moral Economy in the 21st Century. So you have 15 minutes for a prepared comment, and then followed by Q&As. Thank you. Spontaneous comment.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I've been a very small component, a cog in the machinery of overheating for the last 5 years. And I do not have prepared notes because I was not given a text in advance. And yet I have the sense that I've been preparing all my life for this evening. And in an accelerated way since 12 o'clock this afternoon, because many of the points from the earlier discussion came back during this very elegant lecture from Tanya. I want to throw a question straight back at everybody perhaps here, because I suspect most people in the audience at least have some connection with the academic world. Perhaps even a majority can connect with the small discipline, relatively small, social anthropology. What about teleology? What about progress and development in our little academic fields? Do we believe in a progressive social science any longer? The modernization paradigm that Tanya was referring to, at its peak perhaps in the 50s and the 60s, Clifford Geertz was an early product of that period, let's not forget this. But by the end of Geertz's life, all of those illusions had already been thrown away, and anthropology was in a new phase, post-positivist. Postmodern was the word we used most often at that time. And so many of the points about this problematic concept of development and teleology, they were made a generation ago, but more in the spirit of anything goes. Colleagues went off and did their own thing for a long time, and economic anthropology, my own speciality, I think we really lost our way in that period. So I want to use my few minutes with you to play the role of a provocateur, a dinosaur if you like, and give you a few names of scholars from an earlier generation who might still have something to say from the point of view of writing this new book. We have James Ferguson on stage as an invisible interlocutor, if this is a joint product, I understand. I think the critique of naive economists, ideas about progress everywhere at the same pace. Maybe not many of the economists were really that naive, but I think of one of my early teachers, Polly Hill in Cambridge, in the middle of the 1980s, when I was teaching courses on anthropology and development. She published a book called Development Economics on Trial, and made many of the points that she had made in lectures over decades before. She was a niece of John Maynard Keynes. She knew the economics profession inside out, and she could speak on the basis of fieldwork in West Africa about the idiocies of these general models of the economists. Keith Hart was another Cambridge colleague in those days. He was observing urban life in Ghana in the late 1960s in, I I think, ways not so different from the comments that Tanya was just making about seemingly unemployed or underemployed young men in Indonesia a generation later. So I'm asking, has our discipline made much progress in the 30 or 40 years since Keith Hart invented the notion of an informal economy and Polly Hill critiqued the economists? And even earlier, Raymond Firth came to my mind at one point this afternoon, towards the end of the discussions, when a very legitimate question was asked at the panel in our seminar. What about the politics? Specifically, what about Karl Marx's thesis on Feuerbach? We don't just want to understand the world, we want to change it. So what is the academic investment of the overheating project going to do in terms of changing the world? Raymond Firth, when he was asked that kind of question at the height of a neo-Marxist, a Western Marxist phase in the 1960s and the 1970s, responded rather cautiously, referring back to the colonial era when he began his trade as an anthropologist, and pointed out that you could very often have a more substantial impact on the real world, namely the populations that we worked with and would like to serve, to help in some way, if you did not put your party political cards on the table very explicitly, do not wear your politics on your sleeve, but try to make an impact through clear positivist scholarship. That was the best way the anthropologist could make a difference when it came to applied anthropology. Raymond Firth preferred the term engaged anthropology, as I recall. So this is not new. These voices that we hear in the early 21st century, I'm pointing out that they've actually been around for quite a long time in anthropology. I want to mention one name in particular because he came to my mind several times through the list of arenas, I think you called them, Tanya, the points you took us through. Work, land, and then we had the transfers. To me, that translates very neatly into the fictitious commodities of Karl Polanyi, staple reading if you studied economic anthropology when I did in the 1970s. Karl Polanyi, in his critique of formalist traditions, the mainstream in economics, part of his critique, it's there in the original classic study, The Great Transformation, published in 1944. Land, labor, and money are the fictitious commodities, fictitious in the sense that they are not meant to be commodities, should not be traded like other goods, like cucumbers, as Polanyi once said in a metaphor, deploring the mobility of labor, treating labor like just another commodity. But we live in a world in which labor is, in many contexts, just another commodity. And we live in a world in which it's better to be commodified labor than to have that commodity taken away, and even less stable forms of work. Decommodification can be a very bad thing in many parts of the world. You alluded to precaritization, I think is the ugly new English word for this phenomenon, where secure jobs in the global south, but everywhere in the world in practice, those jobs are not what they were a generation ago. So I'm not saying everything is the same today, not at all. The neoliberal era, if that is the shorthand we use, is clearly changing many things. But the gap between those who do have the relatively secure jobs inside factories, they may not be a privileged labor aristocracy as they were in certain late decades of the 20th century, but the gap between those who do have some form of regular employment and those outside what the South Asian scholars I think still refer to as the citadel, that gap hasn't changed much in recent decades. So here too there is a lot of continuity. Yes, so Karl Polanyi should still be on the reading list, I think, and I find his ideas fit rather nicely with your list, continuing to the point where you started engaging with questions of identity, the sources of what brings us together in human communities. Here I would suggest Polanyi's concept of the double movement or the counter movement, because what we are talking about here is the way in which human beings respond to this neoliberal market-dominated society. And of course, the counter-movement is not always benign. You may have trade unions forming where circumstances permit to defend the interests of exploited workers. But you also have jingoism. You have the people, typically the most vulnerable sections of the society, who lined up in the 19th century when they were labeled jingoists, and they're lining up in the early 21st century, and we tend to label them populist nowadays. A very strange label in my opinion, but populist seems to be the new generic. Yes, I should close, I know. Last analogies, going back even further in time. I'm suggesting some of these contemporary issues have been rehearsed in earlier decades in social anthropology, in other social sciences. But it seems to me that the bigger problematic that Tanya raised in this fine lecture about development, progress, this has been with us much, much longer. And perhaps because the first time I got to interact seriously at all with Thomas Hylland Eriksen was in this city. I can't remember what year it was, Thomas, but it must be more than 10 years ago. You organized a workshop together with colleagues in philosophy where Johann Gottfried von Herder was the focus of our attention. And I think of Herder because he is the German counter-movement to the French Enlightenment, to the likes of Voltaire and Condorcet, who believed in progress and a universal reason. And our modernization paradigm of the mid-20th century and our neoliberal economists today, some of them at least, they are still in the tradition of that rationalism of the French Enlightenment, which to Johann Gottfried Herder was just totally unconvincing. He was never prepared to accept that his generation was the result, the culmination of all the efforts of all the previous generations, that God, it was a very theological argument in Herder's case, a very complex argument at the end of the day, and one that has had some bearing on the history of anthropology. It is associated with a relativizing, cultural relativist position, but that would be much too simple a label, I think, to pin on Herder. My point here simply is that for Herder, progress was already being fundamentally contested in the 18th century, within a generation of the earlier manifestos coming out of Paris. So the tensions to which Tanya has drawn attention in her lecture, the tensions that animate a lot of recent anthropological discussion, to which James Ferguson clearly is a major contributor, but I think in our discussions, in our reflections, and because we have Thomas Hylland Eriksen with us, if Herder was the philosopher, the counter-Enlightenment philosopher, but he's a part of that Enlightenment package. That's the way I would see him. He is in an intense dialogue with the rationalists in Paris. And we are continuing that dialogue here in the 21st century with Thomas Hylland Eriksen to guide us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for very thought-provoking comments. Now we're going to have the Q&As, and I encourage you all to ask brief questions, and the answer can be more elaborate, but please keep your questions short.
Just a very short. Well, thanks very much, both of you. This was immensely enjoyable and enlightening, and we continue to learn. And now both of you have interrogated the notion of progress. As we all do. I mean, that's one of the first things we start doing when we start studying anthropology, isn't it? To question and relativize and criticize and interrogate these unilinear ideas about progress and development. And as Chris helpfully pointed out, this has been going on for some time. You know, you have this sort of reason and culture dynamic in the European tradition, written about wonderfully by, amongst others, Ernest Gellner in a book called Reason and Culture, which goes back to Herder and to the Romantic Enlightenment tension. But I would just like to ask, isn't there still something new in the contradictions surrounding the environment? I mean, we can discuss whether there is more or less inequality in the world. Is there more or less poverty? It depends on how you measure and what you're looking for and what kind of instruments you use to measure it. But isn't there something new in the fundamental dilemma of fossil fuels versus sustainability? Which is a new kind of critique of progress, which seems to be a bit more difficult to respond to by people in the World Bank, etc. Or am I wrong?
I think it was addressed to you, and I think you're better qualified.
I thought that my job was to say something and then shut up, but if so I would rather pass that on, but I do not wish to be misunderstood. Clearly, very many things in our world today are very different from the world that Polanyi wrote about 3-4 generations ago, and even compared with the first post-colonial generation that Keith Hart whose name I slipped in. Yes, Keith is fortunately still alive and well, and I'm sure we would all agree that many aspects are rather different today. But there are also continuities. I think Tanya made a very important point when she stressed that the institutional interests that keep this naive faith alive, they are as important now as they have ever been, because those organizations, perhaps that's a better word than institution, those organizations are still so important in this development industry. But my question, what I was really trying to provoke people to think more about, is how the anthropologists of this generation can do better than the anthropologists of a previous generation. Because Polly Hill, at the end of her life, was just terribly disillusioned that anthropology was making itself insignificant. My great hope would be that, as a result of projects like this one, the overheating project, that this changes in our century, and that the evidence collected through ethnographic research in an anthropological framework is taken seriously by all of those who would put forward, I think Tanya used the phrase muscular at one point, robust models. There are still plenty of these people around. I don't know if there are any in the room tonight. If there are old-fashioned Marxists who insist that there is a uniform narrative of capitalist accumulation that can explain everything that's happening all around the planet. I do know a few people like that still, just as I know some neoliberal economists who would argue that there are solutions. Of course, it won't be a new manufacturing sector in every single state, but there will be a rationality to it in terms of capital accumulation, and your unemployed Indonesians will have to go to China to find their work. That's the logic. Against those reductionist logics from the powerful discipline of economics in particular, I think the anthropological, empirically based evidence should be heard in this century. That's why I'm so enthusiastic about overheating.
Let me just say something very briefly about climate. I mean, in the arenas where I work, this is a highly open-ended and differentiated field. Right? When I've asked NGO workers who've been given funds to go to villages, to talk to villagers about climate preparedness, and I ask them, well, what do you say? And they say, well, we tell them it might be getting drier or wetter. It might be getting hotter or colder. And even the idea of climate change in Indonesian translates into the weather. The weather is changeable, to which any self-respecting farmer would say, yes. So, I mean, this isn't a discourse which has taken off everywhere globally, and the impacts are clearly very unevenly felt. I mean, some of these presentations this afternoon suggested that people not only are living effects of climate change, but are being caught up in a discourse in which climate change is the explanatory framework with which they are making claims, for example, as victims, but in other parts of the world, this simply has not happened, right? It's not available as a discourse, it's not necessarily visible as a phenomenon. So even there too, I think we, rather than say this changes everything, as a fellow Canadian says, I mean, for some people, yes. For many people, business as usual, right?
Questions?
Thank you. I was caught up by the concept teleology and the teleology of progress. And somehow teleology has to do with purpose and direction. And of course progress is a quite normative term. But then modernization does not need to be with a purpose or with a moral frame to it. So I think somehow that even if modernization is differentiated and uneven in many respects and need to be, of course, empirically studied, and I totally agree with Tanya, with all your list of things that should be differentiated, wouldn't it still be an overall trend if one looked at the long-term perspective that still is going in the direction of larger scale, more integration, and I see somehow that some kind or level of modernization is still there, but it should be differentiated? Or would you propose your alternative, that this could end up with conclusion that there is no modernization and no common direction totally? And could this direction be non-teleological? Would that be different?
Well, I mean, I think you yourself said that you think of teleology as directional. So I can't really understand what a non-directional teleology would be. Maybe you could just clarify that.
Well, teleology had a direction, but it is not something that it is not the result of a will or a purpose, or so it is not progress because someone needs or wants progress. Something is happening as a result of, or is a kind of emergence, and it's a direction and trend still existing in modernization, and that the world is still modernizing in this trajectory, maybe not as streamlined and unidirectional, but still a quite powerful trend, and that the whole question of sustainability is questioning this, and to get away from this, then we need really some teleology, in the sense that we need to make up our mind and make history move in a different direction by design, much more than what has happened to modernization. Maybe this is not very clear, but that's what I managed.
Well, I guess, I mean, certainly, I mean, I do believe there's historical change and that there is path dependence, right? That what comes next is highly figured by what came before. But I guess what I'm questioning, and what the modernization narrative, I mean, it was an evolutionary narrative in the 19th century. We had primitives to moderns. I mean, the modernization narrative included elements like secularization, rationalization, urbanization, market integration, increases in scale. These were all sort of packaged together into one program, which was in fact set about quite deliberately, being put into place. And I would argue, absurd as it sounds, it still is. Yeah, that's to say, it is still the working assumption of many development agencies, but also national governments, who do promise, growth, prosperity, improved this, that, and the other thing. It's all directional, and it's all, configured by this idea of the good life as an endpoint. So that's where I think, empirically, we really have to challenge this idea that it is all heading in that singular direction. Like the elements need to be disaggregated, but also the idea that people left out of this are somehow, a residuum, or they are in a waiting room, or their time will come. This is, I think, something which, we're still living this, we're living with a set of ideas which I think is in the way of recognizing the, profoundly, and I would say permanently differentiated structures that we're actually seeing. So I don't know if I just repeated myself rather than answering you, but I mean, one of the things you said, larger scale and more integration. What that would look like, if you are, let's say, an indentured plantation worker. I mean, it could be that this crop is being sold on a global market now, as it was also in the 19th century. And you're actually doing a similar kind of work under similar kinds of labor conditions. Increase in scale doesn't really account for that. There have been large-scale global markets for a very long time. People have intersected with them in different ways. So I'm not convinced that scale and its expansion, or even in fact, your idiom, speed and its acceleration, are universals. So, that's again where one would sort of back off from the grand narrative. Yeah. I'm sorry I'm squinting, but this light is directly in my eye.
Yeah, yeah. So I can't see you.
Thank you. My question is so naive that I'm a bit shy to ask it, but it's very short. Thank you very much for your list of research themes, areas, which I think we all would agree are fascinating. It just strikes me, and somehow I'm not sure whether the question really is too naive, that in this listing of labor, land, belonging, transfers, and eventually politics, there's a couple of concepts, or a group of concepts that is completely absent from your listing, which is property / ownership, class, and interest. And that is sort of repeatedly so in your work, and especially also in Jim Ferguson's work. So I would like to ask the question why that is so. Because it seems to me that those concepts connect the, like the connecting cog between the 5 or 6 areas that you mentioned.
I don't think they're absent. Certainly not in my work. Land's End is all about property, ownership, class, and interest, actually. So, these are themes that I've been interested in. But, one of the question of what is the role of property. So, by disaggregating the question of land, for example, in my research that I wrote up in the book Land's End, property, landed property, really is a key element. Whether you own land or not, and how much, and so on, does define class position, whether you will work for others, work for yourself, whether you will employ. So, property in that arena is something which you can peg a lot of analysis, and I did, in fact, on that, because it actually works in that context. But in other arena, it may be the room you rent, not the room that you own. It may be the fact that you have the right to the city, that you can occupy your little shack and not be evicted. And the key there is not property, it's presence. It's the fact that you can stay in the city, and therefore your micro enterprise, your tiny marginal income will work. Whereas if you are resettled outside the city, and you have to pay, bus fares and so on. So, property isn't actually the key dimension in every context. So I don't think it's absent, but I think it's worth asking, how important is it to own land, to own housing? What is the role of capital? How is it accessed, and so on? So I think what we're trying to do, or in this kind of frame of analysis, is it's not a capitalocentric analysis in the sense that many contemporary analysis, especially of neoliberalism, are tracing capital and its trajectories. Whereas we're starting from a bit of a different starting point, which is actually people, their livelihoods, their relations of production, their social engagements, and so on. So it's a different starting point, but it doesn't mean that concepts of capital and property are therefore absent or not important. It's just that we haven't centered them as the main thing to be tracked, as if they were the main movers. Because I think there is a lot of analysis like that, but it often leaves you wondering, well, how then do the people live? And what is important to them? How do they, in fact, relate to each other? Are they actually just atoms being kicked around by the winds of capital, or do they actually think, they have a plan for their lives and are moving along it? These also seem to be important questions which some of this capital-centric analysis actually misses.
Thank you to both of you. Both for reminding us that nothing much seems to have changed in how organizations talk about development and in how anthropologists have critiqued that and not actually gotten through. I wonder whether part of that, and that's a question, has to do with how we think development and progress together. I mean, one take on that conceptual pair, of course, is that development was meant as a critique of progress as it came about in the late 19th century, right? That when you gave up on the idea that you could have this theological change that would all put us in heaven towards the end of a theological process, that's when you had to intervene. And there was a strong belief towards the end of the 19th century, and it was stronger even towards the beginning and end of the 20th century. But then, of course, it more or less died in the 1980s, right? So I wonder whether that development peak that we identify that hasn't really changed at all since the 1950s is more or less perhaps a reflex of having given up on doing anything about the lack of progress.
I mean, I think, you know, the distinction between kind of imminent development, you know, unfolding, which is what I've been calling the teleology of development, like this idea that this is an unfolding process that's directional versus intentional development and intervention. It's, you know, it's a useful distinction. Many people have made it. But the idea of the intentional development was always to unstick the teleological stuff, right? It was to clean up the mess, as Hahn and Shenton described it. But it was also to, you know, remove obstacles, to stimulate where needed. But the underlying idea that there is one direction, there is unfolding to come, and that the role of intervention is to fully realize that teleological potential. So in that sense, they are very deeply linked. One of the more surprising and interesting recent development interventions that I've read about, and it comes back to this question of politics. I think increasingly development agencies are recognizing that kind of power, politics, and interest, to quote a speaker earlier, are in fact everything. You know, that is actually the key to how well people do, you know, to levels of inequality, poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So now they're convinced that politics is the thing. The question is, can you intervene in politics? And so there was a study, a World Bank study recently called, you know, Politics for Development, where they actually tried to render the arena of politics technical in a way that you can then intervene in it to stimulate a progressive politics where it is lacking. But even they had to be honest enough to recognize you cannot rewrite history. So they were on the one hand kind of optimistic that you could make passive people active, you could make people who are inclined to vote for the wrong people look at the data, see sense, you know, recognize who is better at providing public services, and vote for the right guy. Like, you know, they still believe in data. They're not yet in the post-truth era. But even they were ultimately a bit skeptical that you could actually create a sense of entitlement and an active politics of demanding and claiming where it does not exist. So I think this, you know, the terrain of kind of intervention also continues to evolve, but it hasn't gone away. Yeah.
Great. We have 5 more minutes and 2 more questions before bubbles are being served. So I suggest we take the 2 questions in tandem. So first, Knut.
So I come from economics, and I want to start this just by saying that as a behavioral science, economics has regretfully failed to learn from anthropology. However, I think we all can agree that climate change and global sustainability in general, they are problems that has to be solved on a transnational level. And whenever we're talking about negotiations on the transnational levels, we are talking about very clever people representing their own nations, their own nation states. And I don't think that you can come much closer in the real world to the ideal of Homo economicus in any other setting than what we come to when we're talking about negotiations about climate change. And I would therefore like to question, does actually anthropology have a role when we're talking about international negotiations on climate change and sustainability? Thank you.
I can't answer that. Can you?
Can I use this? Yeah.
She wants
Being a non-anthropologist, I just feel like coming to the defense of the overheating project, because I mean, of course there are differences. Of course we can talk about these different societies as different. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But the wager of the overheating project is, can we talk about them as a whole? It's not, I mean, can we still, we can agree that progress is gone, but can we still find ways of talking about the whole? And what would be those ways of doing that? That was That was Herder's question. That's Thomas' question. And the response can't be, well, they're all different. Of course they're different, but that's not the bet, in a sense. The bet would be that, well, what ways could we find to still talk about them as a whole that is politically, emotionally, and environmentally meaningful, right? And in Herder's case, it all, I mean, as those who read him knows that it all starts in the heavens, right? And then he zooms down onto the earth. So it's the fact that it's the common globe that we live on that seems to beg that question, that seems to demand that question, that we have to think about the whole. And then the argument that, well, we're differentiated doesn't really do the trick, does it?
Yes, so the answers would need to be quite brief, and we can continue the conversation also over champagne, which will probably be much more creative discussion. But I suggest you can obviously answer briefly.
Yeah, we just agreed I should go first while Tanya reflects. These are big questions. Anthropologists traditionally respect minorities, so I'm delighted we have a behavioral economist in the room. I would prefer to focus on the Herder questions. There was an earlier one from Henrik about evolutionism. That's also a robust science. And I think Herder's philosophy, theology, if you like, is certainly informed by those cosmological views. It is consistent with a lot of contemporary, sophisticated evolutionary theorizing, because he does not believe in stages and rigid progress of the kind that dominated in the 19th century, that formed the discipline of anthropology so disastrously for generations. So Herder is interesting from many points of view. He is wrongly viewed as a precursor for the kind of ethno-nationalists that we have a lot of trouble with in Europe at the moment. Some people see him as a Vorreiter for movements like Pegida in Germany, but that's totally unfair, because Herder is saying all the time, everything is changing, the human body is changing, communities are changing. I found a lovely sentence recently where he says, the Germans used to be like Patagonians. Patagonia was considered a very exotic place at the end of the 18th century. The Germans were once like the Patagonians. They're not like that today in Goethe's Weimar. And in the future, in future climates, there is a vocabulary of climate change in Herder. That's typical of his age, of course. He was not aware of global warming. It wasn't happening then. But he says, in the future climates of this part of Germany will be different again. So you can certainly think with Herder very creatively about all of these issues. And yes, I've always understood overheating as a brilliantly conceived holistic project. That's why I signed up to it.
I think that would need to be the final comment. But thank you so much, Tanya Lee and Chris Hahn. Well, you can obviously, yeah. We have time for one more comment, of course.
Well,
yes?
just to say that, the question of the whole, what is the whole? I mean, I think that the way I think about this is that, one can say that it is global, but also differentiated. These are not opposed. So, global interconnection is something one can recognize at the same time as acknowledging profound differentiation. And I think to acknowledge differentiation is not just to say, well, we're all different, how banal, right? I mean, I think the question is, well, what are the kinds of difference which are actually important to study? Why are they important to study? How does one set of issues, let's say around land or labor, relate to issues around membership or politics? I mean, we've tried to lay out something which isn't just a random set of questions which shows how different we are, but which actually tries to understand that combination of global and differentiated in a way which could be useful, across a range of different sites. So in that sense, I think it's actually quite congruent with what you have been doing in the Overheating Project, which when I read the title, I thought, well, that sounds very linear. But when I read the text, I thought, actually, no, unevenness is everywhere in this actual project, and that is in fact what you have been investigating. Although I didn't really get a sense of how you are parsing that. What are the elements of differentiation in your project? But clearly, it's alive and well.
So a warm applause to Tanya Lee and Chris Hahn. So now we have half an hour break, and you're all welcome to a glass of bubbles. After all, this is a celebration.